The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the observation deck at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. 12-year-old Anthony stood with his back straight, eyes fixed on the runway where a Boeing 737 was preparing for takeoff. He clutched his worn blue notebook tightly, the pages filled with careful handwriting documenting tail numbers, aircraft types, and flight patterns. His mom had given him the notebook for his birthday 3 months ago, and it was already half full. Anthony adjusted his glasses and clicked his mechanical pencil. Flight 1826, departure at 3:42 p.m., he whispered to himself as he jotted down the information. He loved the precision of aviation, how everything had a code, a pattern, a purpose. The roar of engines filled the air as the plane accelerated down the runway, and Anthony couldn't help but smile as it lifted into the sky. He'd been coming to this spot ever since his mom, Denise, had first taken him to work when he was 9. Back then, he couldn't tell the difference between an Airbus and a Boeing. Now, at 12, he could identify most commercial aircraft just by their silhouette against the sky. One day, he thought, watching the contrails form, that'll be me up there. Anthony didn't notice the man watching him from 20 feet away. Captain Robert Walker had been with Legacy Airlines for 18 years. He'd seen the security protocols tighten after 9/11 events, had sat through countless security briefings about remaining vigilant. And something about the boy taking notes and photographs of aircraft made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The boy had been there for over an hour, methodically writing things down, taking pictures with his phone. Walker watched as the kid referenced something on his phone, then wrote more in his notebook. Was he logging flight patterns, security rotations? Probably nothing, Walker told himself, but the thought nagged at him. What if it wasn't nothing? What if he walked away and later learned something had happened? He'd never forgive himself. Walker approached a nearby security guard, a heavy-set man with Tom Tisan on his name badge. "Excuse me," Walker said quietly, showing his airline ID. "See that kid over there? The one taking notes? He's been photographing planes and writing down tail numbers and flight times for over an hour." The security guard looked over at Anthony, who was now using his phone to zoom in on a distant aircraft. "Kids are interested in planes," Thompson said with a shrug. "Not unusual around here." Walker frowned. "I understand that, but he's been very systematic, and he keeps checking his phone like he's confirming something. In today's world, we can't be too careful." Thompson studied the boy more carefully. The kid did seem unusually focused for someone his age, and he was alone, which was odd. No parent in sight. "I'll check it out," Thompson finally said. He radioed another security officer for backup before approaching Anthony. Anthony was so engrossed in watching a taxiing plane that he didn't notice the security officers until they were right beside him. "Excuse me, young man," Thompson said, his voice stern. "What exactly are you doing here?" Anthony looked up, surprised. "Just watching planes, sir," he said, holding up his notebook. "I'm keeping track of the flights." "Why are you writing down flight numbers and taking photographs?" the second officer asked, positioning herself slightly behind Anthony. "It's my hobby," Anthony explained, confusion creeping into his voice. "I want to be a pilot someday." Captain Walker approached then, standing a few feet away, but close enough to observe. "May I see your notebook?" Thompson asked, holding out his hand. Anthony hesitated, then handed it over. The security officer flipped through pages of neatly documented flights, aircraft specifications, and personal observations. "Where are your parents?" Thompson asked, his tone softening slightly but still authoritative. "My mom works here," Anthony said. "She's in a meeting. I'm waiting for her." "And who is your mother?" Walker interjected, still not convinced. "Denise Williams," Anthony said proudly. "She works for the FAA." Walker exchanged glances with the security officers. The boy could be making it up. "I think we should verify that," he said firmly. "In the meantime, we should move to a more secure location to continue this conversation." As the security officers began to escort Anthony away from the observation deck, the boy reached for his phone. "I'll call my mom." "I'll need to hold on to that," Thompson said, taking the phone from Anthony's hand. "Just a precaution." Anthony's heart raced as he was led through the terminal, the captain following closely behind. He didn't understand what was happening or why he was in trouble. All he knew was that his perfect afternoon had suddenly turned into something frightening, and his mother was nowhere in sight. Anthony tried to stay calm as the security officers led him through the bustling terminal. People turned to stare, some whispering behind their hands. His cheeks burned with embarrassment. What had he done wrong? All he wanted was to watch planes, something he'd been doing for years. They took him to a small room near the security checkpoint. It had no windows, just a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the white walls look even more stark. Anthony's stomach twisted into knots. "Sit down, please," Officer Thompson said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Anthony sat, placing his hands on the cold metal table. His notebook and phone lay just out of reach, where Thompson had placed them. The second security officer stood by the door, arms crossed. Now Thompson began, flipping through Anthony's notebook again. "Explain to me exactly what you were doing." "I told you already," Anthony said, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. "I was watching planes. I like aviation. I want to be a pilot someday." The door opened and Captain Walker stepped in, still in his pilot's uniform with the 4 stripes on his shoulders gleaming under the harsh lights. "Any progress?" Walker asked Thompson, barely glancing at Anthony. "We're just getting started," Thompson replied. Walker pulled out a chair and sat down across from Anthony. "Young man, taking detailed notes about aircraft movements and security patterns is suspicious behavior. You understand that, right?" "But I wasn't," Anthony started. Walker cut him off. "You were documenting tail numbers, flight patterns, arrivals, departures. In today's world, that raises red flags." Anthony blinked rapidly, trying not to cry. "It's just my hobby. My mom knows all about it. She works here." "So you said," Thompson replied, his tone skeptical. "At the FAA." "Yes," Anthony nodded eagerly. "She's in a meeting. If you just let me call her." "We'll contact her," Walker said firmly. "But first, I need to understand why a child your age is alone in an airport making detailed notes about aircraft." "I'm 12, Anthony protested, "and my mom lets me wait at the observation deck. I've been doing it for years." The second officer moved closer. "What exactly does your mother do at the FAA?" Anthony sat up straighter, a hint of pride breaking through his fear. "She's an administrator. She oversees this whole region." Walker and Thompson exchanged looks. Anthony couldn't read their expressions, but he could tell they didn't believe him. "That's quite a claim," Walker said. "What's your mother's full name again?" "Denise Williams," Anthony repeated. Thompson wrote it down. "And your name?" "Anthony Williams." The door opened again, and a police officer stepped in, his presence filling the small room. Anthony's heart sank even further. "This is Officer Ramirez," Thompson explained. "He's going to ask you a few more questions while we verify your information." "Am I in trouble?" Anthony asked, his voice cracking. "That depends," Walker said, standing up, "on whether you're telling us the truth." Ramirez took Walker's seat. Unlike the others, he had a gentler approach. "Hey there, Anthony. I understand you like airplanes." Anthony nodded cautiously. "Me too," Ramirez said with a small smile. "My dad was in the Air Force." For a moment, Anthony felt a flicker of hope, but then Ramirez's expression turned serious. "But I need you to understand why everyone's concerned. When someone takes detailed notes about airport operations, it can look like surveillance. Do you know what that means?" "Like spying?" Anthony asked, incredulous. "I wasn't spying. I just like planes." In the corner, Walker muttered something to Thompson about better safe than sorry and can't take chances these days. Ramirez pushed Anthony's notebook toward him. "Can you explain some of these notes to me? What does rotation point alpha mean?" "That's what my mom calls it," Anthony explained. "It's where planes start to lift off the runway. I'm tracking which planes lift off earlier or later depending on their weight and model." As Anthony tried to explain his innocent observations, he couldn't help but notice how Walker kept checking his watch, how Thompson stood with his arms crossed, how they'd positioned themselves between him and the door. Anthony's phone screen lit up with an incoming call, his mother's face flashing on the screen. Thompson quickly reached over and silenced it, turning the phone face down. "Please." Anthony said, tears finally spilling onto his cheeks. "That's my mom. Just let me talk to her." "We'll handle this professionally," Walker insisted. "If she really works for the FAA, we'll find out soon enough." What none of them realized was that Denise Williams had already been alerted that her son was being detained, and she was already on her way. At heels clicking rapidly across the terminal floor, her FAA credentials swinging from the lanyard around her neck, and her expression set in stone. Denise Williams was in the middle of a budget meeting when her phone vibrated. She ignored it at first, focusing on the spreadsheet projected on the wall. When it vibrated again, she glanced down. 5 missed calls from Anthony. Something was wrong. "Excuse me," she said, standing up. "I need to take this." She stepped into the hallway and called Anthony back. No answer. A knot formed in her stomach. Anthony always answered her calls. She texted him, "Where are you? Everything okay?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then a single message, "Help. Security took me." Denise's heart hammered against her ribs. She called again. No answer. She knew exactly where Anthony had been, the observation deck, his favorite spot. Without bothering to explain to her colleagues, she grabbed her blazer and headed for the elevators. Denise moved through the airport with purpose, her low heels clicking against the polished floor. Airport employees nodded at her as she passed. She wore her FAA credentials around her neck, the same ones that granted her access to every part of the airport. As the regional administrator for the FAA's Southeast Division, few doors were closed to her. She tried Anthony's phone again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. Her worry turned to anger. Who had taken her son? And why? At the security checkpoint, she flashed her credentials. "I need to know if a 12-year-old boy was detained in the last hour." The TSA agent's eyes widened. "Ms. Williams, I believe there is a situation ongoing. Let me call my supervisor." "No time," Denise said, already moving past the checkpoint. "Where are they holding him?" "Interview room B, but..." Denise was already striding down the corridor, her face set in determination. She knew the layout of this airport better than her own home. Interview room B was where they took people for additional questioning, not where they should be taking a child. Outside the door, she took a deep breath and straightened her blazer. Then she pushed the door open without knocking. The room fell silent. Anthony sat at the metal table, tears streaming down his face. A police officer stood nearby, while 2 security guards and a pilot in uniform turned to face her. Denise recognized the pilot's uniform, Legacy Airlines, captain's stripes. "Mom," Anthony cried, jumping up. "Anthony," she said softly, her eyes never leaving the men who had detained her son. "Are you okay?" "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," one of the security officers, Thompson, according to his name tag, began. Denise cut him off by holding up her credentials. "Denise Williams, Federal Aviation Administration Regional Administrator. That's my son you're detaining." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The police officer straightened his posture. Thompson's eyes widened. But it was the pilot whose reaction was most noticeable. His face drained of color as recognition dawned. "Ms. Williams," he stammered. "I didn't realize." "Clearly," Denise said, her voice as cold as ice. "May I ask why my son is being held in an interrogation room, and why his calls to me were ignored?" "We found him engaged in suspicious behavior," the pilot explained, his confidence faltering. "Taking detailed notes on flight patterns, aircraft movements." "You mean his aviation journal?" Denise moved to the table and picked up Anthony's notebook. "The one I gave him for his birthday. The one he's been keeping for 3 years." "We couldn't know that," Thompson interjected. "In today's climate." "In today's climate," Denise echoed. "A black child can't pursue his interest in aviation without being treated like a criminal." The room fell silent again. Anthony wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Captain." Denise looked at the pilot's name tag. "Walker, Legacy Airlines, correct?" He nodded stiffly. "I believe I signed off on your airline's safety protocols just last month," she said. "I don't recall profiling children being part of those protocols." Captain Walker's face flushed. "Ms. Williams, I was simply following security procedures." "No," Denise said firmly. "You were following your assumptions. And they led you to detain a child who has every right to be here, every right to pursue his interest in aviation. She turned to Officer Ramirez. I want all security footage of this incident preserved. Immediately. Ramirez nodded, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, ma'am. Denise put her arm around Anthony's shoulders. Come on, honey, let's go. As they reached the door, she turned back to the three men. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Captain Walker watched them leave, the weight of his mistake settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had no idea that the child he reported was the son of the woman whose signature appeared on his airline's operating certificates, the woman who had the power to launch investigations and ground flights. And from the look in Denise Williams' eyes, she intended to use every bit of that power. The hallway outside the interrogation room buzzed with activity. Word traveled fast in airports. Staff members glanced nervously at Denise and Anthony as they passed. An airport operations manager rushed toward them, his face a mask of concern. Ms. Williams, I just heard what happened. I am so sorry. Denise held up her hand. Not now, Greg. I need a moment with my son. She guided Anthony to a quiet corner near a bank of windows overlooking the tarmac. Kneeling down to his eye level, she gently wiped a tear from his cheek. You okay, baby? Anthony nodded, though his lower lip still trembled. They thought I was doing something bad, Mom, just because I was writing in my notebook. Denise took a deep breath, fighting to keep her own emotions in check. I know, and it was wrong of them. So wrong. Behind them, the door to the interrogation room opened. Captain Walker emerged, followed by Thompson and Officer Ramirez. They huddled in conversation, throwing nervous glances toward Denise and Anthony. What happens now? Anthony asked, his eyes following their gaze. Now, Denise said, standing up straight, we make sure this never happens to another child. She squeezed Anthony's shoulder and turned to face the men. They approached cautiously, like people edging near a sleeping lion. Ms. Williams, Captain Walker began, his voice strained with forced politeness. If I could have a word in private. Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my son, Denise replied coolly. Walker swallowed hard. I want to express my sincere apologies for the misunderstanding. In my position, we're trained to be vigilant about unusual behavior around aircraft. A child taking notes is unusual behavior. Denise interrupted. When those notes are as detailed as your son's, yes, it can raise concerns, Walker continued. I was simply following protocol. Denise's eyes narrowed. Which protocol specifically, Captain Walker? Please enlighten me. Which Legacy Airlines protocol instructs pilots to profile children based on appearance? Walker's face flushed. That's not what happened. I would have reported any person documenting flight patterns so meticulously. Is that so? Denise reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she pulled up a video and held it out for Walker to see. On the screen, security camera footage showed Walker walking past an older white man with a camera and notebook at the same observation deck, barely giving him a second glance. This was taken 40 minutes before you reported my son, Denise said. Same behavior. Different response from you. Can to explain the discrepancy. Walker's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Officer Ramirez stepped forward. Ms. Williams, if I may. Officer Ramirez, I appreciate that you were called in after the fact, Denise acknowledged. But these two gentlemen have some serious explaining to do. A small crowd had gathered at a discreet distance, airport employees watching the confrontation unfold. Among them was a woman in a Legacy Airlines executive uniform. She approached cautiously. Ms. Williams? I'm Lisa Chen, Vice President of Operations for Legacy at Hartsfield-Jackson. May I join this conversation? Denise nodded curtly. Chen turned to Captain Walker. Captain, I believe you're scheduled for a flight to Denver in 90 minutes? Yes, but... You're relieved of that duty, Chen said firmly. Report to my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. Walker paled. Lisa, this is a simple misunderstanding. Is it? Chen cut him off. Because from where I stand, you've potentially exposed our airline to a discrimination complaint from the FAA regional administrator herself. She turned to Denise. Ms. Williams, I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. Denise nodded. I should hope so. Because tomorrow morning, I'm convening a special task force on security procedures and racial bias at this airport. Officer Thompson, Captain Walker, consider this your official invitation to participate. Thompson looked like he might be sick. Walker stared at the floor. Anthony watched this exchange with wide eyes, his earlier fear replaced with something else: pride. His mother stood firm, her voice never raising above a conversational tone, yet everyone around her seemed to bend to her authority. "Mom," he whispered, tugging her sleeve. "Are they going to lose their jobs?" Denise looked down at her son, her expression softening. "This isn't about punishment, Anthony. It's about learning and making things better." She looked back at the group of professionals. "Isn't that right?" Walker finally met her eyes. In that moment, he understood that his career now hung in the balance, not because of a simple mistake, but because he had failed to question his own assumptions. And the woman who held his future in her hands was watching to see if he could learn from it. The drive home was quiet. Anthony stayed out the window, watching planes take off in the distance. Denise glanced at him occasionally, worried about how the day's events might affect his love of aviation. "You still want to be a pilot someday?" she finally asked. Anthony turned to her, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. "Even more now?" Denise raised an eyebrow. "Really? After what happened today?" "Because of what happened today," Anthony said firmly. "I want to be the kind of pilot who changes things." Denise smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She reached over and squeezed his hand. By the time they arrived home, Denise's phone was buzzing nonstop. News of the incident had reached the highest levels of both the FAA and Legacy Airlines. She settled Anthony with his favorite pizza and a movie before retreating to her home office to deal with the fallout. First was a call from her boss, the FAA administrator himself. "Denise, I heard what happened. Are you and Anthony okay?" "We're managing," she replied, sinking into her office chair. "But this can't be swept under the rug, sir." "Absolutely not," he agreed. "I've already instructed legal to preserve all security footage, and the Secretary of Transportation wants a full briefing tomorrow." After finishing that call, Denise opened her laptop. She began typing an email requesting all incident reports, security logs, and staff statements. Halfway through, her phone rang again. It was Lisa Chen from Legacy Airlines. "Ms. Williams, I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing the security footage," Lisa said without preamble. "It's worse than I initially thought." "How so?" Denise asked, her stomach tightening. "Captain Walker didn't just report Anthony. He specifically told security to treat him as a high-concern individual. And when Anthony first tried to call you, Walker suggested they confiscate his phone." Denise closed her eyes, a wave of anger washing over her. "I want copies of everything you found, Ms. Chen. Everything." "Already being compiled," Lisa assured her. "And Ms. Williams, off the record? As a woman of color in aviation myself, I'm truly sorry this happened to your son." After hanging up, Denise sat in silence for a moment. Through the open door, she could hear Anthony laughing at something in his movie. The sound brought her back to what mattered most, making sure her son, and other children like him, would be treated with dignity. She picked up her phone again and texted her assistant, "Schedule an emergency meeting for tomorrow, 8 a.m. Topic: Bias in security protocols. Invite airport security leadership, airline representatives, and civil rights compliance officers." Within minutes, her assistant replied, "Meeting scheduled." Word is already spreading about what happened. At least 6 reporters have called for comment. Denise wasn't surprised. An incident involving the FAA regional administrator's son was bound to make news. She needed to get ahead of it. She drafted a brief statement emphasizing that the incident would be thoroughly investigated and used as a catalyst for reviewing security protocols across the region's airports. She emphasized that while vigilance was essential for aviation safety, so was treating all passengers, regardless of age or race, with respect and dignity. As she worked, she heard a knock on her office door. Anthony stood there, holding 2 ice cream sandwiches. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. Denise smiled and took it. "How are you feeling, really?" Anthony shrugged, sitting on the edge of her desk. "Kinda weird. Like, I'm mad about what happened, but also what? I keep thinking about that pilot's face when he realized who you were, Anthony said with a small smile. That was pretty awesome. Denise laughed despite herself. It's not about making people afraid, Anthony. It's about making them think. I know, Anthony said, suddenly serious. But what if they don't learn? What if they just do it to someone else's kid? Denise looked at her email draft, then at the growing list of people who would be in tomorrow's meeting. That's why we're not letting this go, she said firmly. Tomorrow, we start making changes. As if on cue, her phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from Legacy Airlines CEO requesting a personal meeting. Attached was a draft of a new anti-bias training program they wanted to implement immediately. See? Denise showed Anthony the email. It's already working. Anthony nodded, looking more at peace than he had all day. But Denise knew this was just the beginning. The real work would start tomorrow, turning one painful incident into meaningful change across an entire industry. Captain Walker hadn't slept all night. He sat in his car in the Legacy Airlines parking lot 30 minutes early for his 9 a.m. meeting, rehearsing what he would say. Nothing sounded right. How could he explain his actions without making excuses? How could he make this right? His phone buzzed. It was his wife. How are you holding up? Not great, he texted back. We'll call after the meeting. Inside Legacy's administrative offices, the atmosphere was tense. Employees whispered as he walked past. In the break room, a TV showed a news anchor talking about an incident at Hartsfield-Jackson involving an FAA official's son. No names were mentioned, but Walker knew it was only a matter of time. Lisa Chen's assistant led him into a conference room where several people waited. Lisa herself, Legacy's chief legal counsel, the head of HR, and a man Walker didn't recognize. Captain Walker, Lisa gestured to an empty chair. This is Thomas Powell, our new diversity and inclusion consultant. Walker nodded stiffly as he sat down. Am I being fired? He asked bluntly. Lisa folded her hands on the table. That depends on several factors, Captain. But before we discuss consequences, we need to understand exactly what happened yesterday. For the next hour, Walker relived every moment of the previous day, his initial suspicion of Anthony, his decision to alert security, and his growing insistence that the boy be treated as a security risk. As he spoke, he could hear how it sounded, how thin his justifications were. When did you realize your mistake? Thomas asked, his tone neutral. Walker swallowed hard. When Ms. Williams walked in, but, he paused, that's not right. I should have realized it sooner. Across town at FAA headquarters, Denise led her own meeting. The conference room was packed. Airport security directors, airline representatives, TSA officials, and civil rights officers all waited nervously as she distributed a report. This incident report details what happened to my son yesterday, she began, her voice steady. But this meeting isn't about my son. It's about every child who's been profiled, every passenger who's been targeted based on appearance rather than behavior. She clicked a button, and security footage appeared on the screen. Anthony at the observation deck, writing in his notebook. Other people around him doing similar things, unbothered by security. Our security protocols have gaps, Denise continued. Gaps that allow bias to affect decision-making. Today, we're going to address those gaps. Back at Legacy Airlines, Walker was shown similar footage. This is hard to explain, he admitted, watching himself ignore other plane spotters while fixating on Anthony. We're not asking you to explain it, Lisa said firmly. We're asking you to recognize it and change it. The HR director slid a document across the table. This is a temporary suspension notice. 3 months, unpaid. Walker's heart sank. 3 months without pay would be difficult for his family. However, Lisa continued, there's an alternative. Thomas Powell leaned forward. Captain Walker, we're developing a comprehensive anti-bias training program. We need pilots who can speak honestly about their experiences, including mistakes they've made. Would you be willing to help develop and lead this program during your suspension? You'd receive partial pay. Walker blinked in surprise. You want me to teach others about what I did wrong? Sometimes the best teachers are those who've made the mistakes themselves, Thomas said quietly. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson faced his own reckoning at the airport security office. His supervisor showed him the new guidelines being implemented immediately. additional training for all security personnel, a revised approach to handling minors, and mandatory review of any incident involving children before escalation. This came straight from the FAA, his supervisor explained. And honestly, it's long overdue. Thompson nodded, still processing how quickly things had changed. And my position? Probation, and you'll be the first to complete the new training. By late afternoon, news of the changes had spread throughout the aviation community. Security protocols were being reviewed at airports across the region. Airlines were examining their own training programs. In a quiet moment between meetings, Denise called Anthony at home. "How's it going, Mum?" he asked. "Did you fire anybody?" Denise smiled despite her exhaustion. "That's not how this works, honey, but changes are happening. Big ones." "Good," Anthony said firmly. "So, is it okay if I go back to the observation deck sometime?" Denise felt a lump in her throat. Her son's passion remained undimmed. "Yes," she said, "and next time, I think you'll find things very different." As she hung up, an email notification appeared on her screen. It was from Captain Walker, requesting a meeting, not as an FAA official and a pilot, but as a parent and a child with a shared love of aviation. 6 months later, Anthony stood at the edge of a stage, heart pounding in his chest. The conference room at the Atlanta Airport Marriott was packed with aviation professionals, pilots in uniform, TSA agents, airport security staff, and airline executives. His mother sat in the front row, giving him an encouraging nod. "You've got this," she mouthed silently. The moderator, a tall woman from the Department of Transportation, approached the microphone. "Our next speaker has a unique perspective on airport security and bias. Please welcome Anthony Williams." The applause felt deafening as Anthony stepped up to the podium. At 12 years old, he had to stand on a small platform to reach the microphone. 6 months ago, he began, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "I was detained at this airport for writing in this notebook." He held up his blue aviation journal, now filled with even more detailed observations. "Someone saw me, a black kid taking notes about planes, and assumed I was dangerous." The room was completely silent. "That day was scary," Anthony continued. "But what happened after wasn't about punishment. It was about making things better." He looked at his mother and smiled. "My mom taught me that real change doesn't come from getting mad. It comes from getting to work." In the third row, Captain Walker watched Anthony speak. The past 6 months had transformed his career. Instead of flying routes, he'd been working with the airline's newly formed inclusion team, sharing his story with other pilots and crew members. Today marked his return to active flight status, but first he wanted to hear Anthony speak. "The new youth aviation program has already signed up over 200 kids," Anthony said proudly. "Kids who look like me and kids who don't. All of us learning about aviation together." This program had been Denise's idea, but Anthony had helped design it. Weekend classes at the airport taught kids about flight physics, navigation, and aviation careers. The observation deck, once the site of Anthony's detention, was now a regular classroom. After Anthony finished speaking, the moderator invited the panel to join him on stage. Denise was there, alongside Lisa Chen from Legacy Airlines, Thomas Powell, and, to Anthony's surprise, Captain Walker. For the next hour, they discussed the changes implemented across the aviation industry, new security protocols, revised training for all airport staff, and the wildly successful youth program. The most important change, Denise explained to the audience, has been in how we approach security. We're teaching staff to focus on specific behaviors, not on who's exhibiting them. When the panel ended, people swarmed the stage to talk to Anthony. Flight school representatives handed him brochures. A retired Air Force pilot gave him his wings pin. A group of black pilots invited him to their next association meeting. As the crowd thinned, Captain Walker approached Anthony and Denise. "That was quite a speech," he said to Anthony, genuine admiration in his voice. "Thanks," Anthony replied, still somewhat guarded. Walker handed him a small envelope. "I'm flying to Chicago tomorrow. First flight back after everything. I thought you might want to join me in the cockpit before takeoff. With your mother's permission, of course." Anthony's eyes widened. He looked at his mother questioningly. Denise studied Walker for a moment. These past months, She'd seen him work tirelessly on the new training programs. He'd spoken honestly about his mistake to countless colleagues, never making excuses. And most importantly, he'd listened and learned. "I think that could be arranged," she said finally. Later that evening, as they drove home, Anthony was unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" Denise asked. "Just thinking," he replied. "Remember when you said this wasn't about punishment, but about learning?" "I do." "I think Captain Walker really did learn," Anthony said thoughtfully. "And because of what happened to me, lots of other kids won't have to go through the same thing." Denise reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's how change happens. One person, one incident, one policy at a time." The next morning, Anthony stood in the cockpit of a Boeing 737, wearing a pilot's hat that was slightly too big for his head. Captain Walker showed him the pre-flight checklist, explaining each step with patience and respect. Through the cockpit window, Anthony could see the observation deck where everything had started. A group of children stood there now, part of the weekend aviation program, watching planes with the same wonder he had always felt. As he left the cockpit, Captain Walker stopped him. "Anthony, thank you." "For what?" "For showing me what I couldn't see before." Anthony nodded, understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about one boy and one pilot anymore. It was about changing an entire system, one person at a time. And it had begun with a notebook, a curious boy, and a mother who refused to let injustice stand.